My name is David Forrester, and my life was once a carefully orchestrated symphony of simplicity and duty. Born into a modest family in the Midwest, I learned early on to value hard work. My father, a mechanic, and my mother, a school teacher, instilled in me a sense of respect for commitment and the rewards of perseverance. Despite these values, I never could have predicted the turbulence that would later shake my carefully constructed world. Meeting Mabel was like a scene out of a romance movie. She had this magnetic energy that drew everyone toward her, and I was no exception. When we married, I believed I had won life's lottery. The two small towns we lived between welcomed us, and together we built what seemed like a stable life. Or so I thought. Over time, I began to notice cracks in the foundation of our relationship. Subtle things, like her growing restlessness and my increasing focus on work. Janet, Mabel's younger sister, had always been around. She was the complete opposite of Mabel, practical, grounded, and fiercely independent. I never gave her much thought outside of our family gatherings or casual chats at the workshop, where she worked on computers I repaired. That changed when I began noticing her thoughtful presence in moments when I felt Mabel slipping away emotionally. Things took a definitive turn the day Mabel introduced me to Jeff Rosberg. He was charming in that overconfident, slimy way that sets off alarms in people who've seen enough of life's darker corners. But Mabel seemed captivated by him, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. I tried to convince myself it was harmless, just a fleeting distraction, but deep down I knew otherwise. It was Janet who first approached me about her suspicions, her voice filled with a mix of anger and protectiveness. She had caught wind of Mabel's growing attachment to Jeff through whispers in town and her own observations. I brushed her concerns aside, unwilling to confront the possibility that my marriage was unraveling. My denial only made the inevitable confrontation more painful. The night before everything fell apart, I found myself alone in the shop, staring at the disassembled parts of an old Mustang I'd been restoring for years. The car had been a gift to myself during the early days of my marriage, symbolizing the dreams I had for a life filled with love, adventure, and stability. As I held a wrench in my hand, I realized how much of myself I had invested in that dream, and how much of it was slipping through my fingers. I scanned the dimly lit room, but everything around me remained obscured. Even without sight, I was acutely aware of an overwhelming presence, an intoxicating mix of emotions that nearly diverted my attention from the sharp, throbbing pain cutting through my head. Instinctively, I turned toward a faint trace of a musky fragrance nearby, its familiarity throwing me off balance as dizziness set in. With effort, I steadied myself, only to notice the undeniable reality. The body pressed lightly against mine was not Mabel's. "Who?" I began, but the word ignited another explosion of pain in my head. "Relax, baby," a familiar voice said. That voice, husky and rough, could only belong to one person in town, my wife's sister. My heart sank as I realized how bad things had gotten. I strained to remember anything from the past 24 hours, but drew a complete blank. No memory, no explanation for how Janet ended up in bed with me. "Janet, as nice as this is, can you stop?" I managed. Light suddenly flooded the room, piercing my head like a dagger. "Oops, shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "But I bet you're wondering what's going on." Yeah, I said, my head throbbing. "That's one of many questions." "You don't remember last night?" she asked. "Not a thing," I admitted. "But judging by how my head feels, I'm guessing booze was involved." "You needed to let loose," she said, "and trust me, we're going to make a habit of it." "What do you mean, we?" I asked. "Mabel's going to eliminate me." "Mabel's gone," she replied. "Don't you remember?" "Tequila?" I groaned. "Someone must have given me tequila. I lose my memory and do stupid things when I drink it." "Please tell me I didn't have more than 2 shots." Janet shook her head, but even that small motion made my stomach churn. I bolted out of bed, aiming for the bathroom, but slammed into the wall. She pointed to the right door, and I stumbled through it just in time to empty my stomach into the toilet. "Better?" she asked, handing me mouthwash and a toothbrush. Blue, my favorite color. As I brushed my teeth, Janet stood close, her arms wrapping around me from behind, her firm body pressed against mine, a stark reminder of our undressedness. When I finished brushing, she turned me around. "Let me check," she said, echoing a phrase Mabel used to say. I flashed a grin, but she shook her head. "Not like that." She kissed me deeply, her body flush against mine. Despite my hangover, my body reacted instantly. "So, even after last night, you still want more?" Janet teased. What I want are answers, I said firmly. Get dressed, she said. We have to go to the bank. When? It opens in an hour, she replied. But we'll grab coffee and I'll explain everything.
I spent the entire night walking along the road. Dogs chased me more than once, and my legs were scratched and bleeding. Just yesterday, I was wearing expensive high heels, but they were useless on these country roads. The shredded remains of those shoes were long gone. Thankfully, daylight finally arrived. I was still miles from town, and home felt even further away, if I even had a home left. My sister likely made sure I didn't. I couldn't believe Janet would betray me after everything I'd done for her. She'd always been jealous, but this was a new low. Whoever said blood is thicker than water never met Janet. Eventually, a truck pulled up behind me. It was the Miller boy with Sarah Winslow and a few others, likely heading to the lake. I waved, but as soon as they recognized me, they sped past. Their reactions stung. Small towns aren't known for forgiving scandal, but the way they looked at me was harsher than I expected. Had I really fallen so far, beyond even Christian mercy? Just yesterday morning, I'd woken up in my luxurious bed, the reigning queen of these two small Iowa towns. Thanks to my husband, not anything I'd done. Dave wasn't even from here. He came with me after we met in Chicago, where my parents had moved for better health care for my mother. Dave followed me home, married me, and never left. Over the years, he built a thriving business fixing farm equipment and later electronics. The towns adored him, especially after he began offering farmers deferred payments and maintained the local school's computers for free. Meanwhile, I'd become the outsider. As Dave stayed humble, I embraced a more glamorous lifestyle, dressing in designer clothes and driving a Mercedes. The townsfolk adored Dave's generosity, but resented my big city airs. I thought they were just narrow-minded, but after last night, I realized I'd been wrong. Janet, my sister, played a part in my downfall. I'd begged Dave to hire her as a computer technician only for her to repay me with betrayal. She'd always idolized Dave, her childhood crush evolving into something deeper. I'd grown complacent in my love for him, treating him like a worn-out pair of shoes, while he quietly remained the kind-hearted man everyone admired. Then came Jeffrey Rosberg, a charming attorney who flattered me endlessly. For months we had an affair, but last night I learned most of what he'd told me, including his marital status, was a lie. Ironically, Jeff had once dated Janet, but she saw through him and moved on. I wish someone had warned me. Instead, I'd fallen for his act, which ultimately led to my humiliation and this lonely walk. I needed to reach town, find a ride home, and withdraw money if all else failed. Everything I'd built had crumbled, and the blame wasn't just on Janet or Jeff. It was on me, too.
Are you dressed yet? Janet called out. Despite feeling awful, her yelling somehow felt normal. Come here if you want coffee, she added. Please stop yelling, I muttered, dragging myself into her spotless kitchen. Janet, completely undressed, stood by the coffee maker. As I entered, she turned, kissed me, and pressed her body against mine. Shouldn't you put on some clothes? I asked, clinging to a shred of dignity. No, she replied, smiling. I want you to remember me like this. She kissed me again. Why do you keep doing this? I asked, exasperated. Because I don't know how this ends, she said, her smile fading slightly. I need to give it everything, just in case it doesn't work out. What's the last thing you remember? She asked, pulling me to the kitchen table and holding my hand. I thought hard, memories slowly returning. I got a call last night about the drive-in theater's projectors. They needed help with the wireless cameras used between films. It turned out to be a software issue, so I tested it by broadcasting footage of people in cars on the big screen. But then, I paused, nausea rising. Your sister, my wife, with Jeff, touching her. My voice cracked. Janet stroked my hand gently. Do you remember what happened after? I ran to his car, pulled him out, and punched him, I said. The sheriff showed up, and people claimed Jeff fell and hit his face on the car while drunk. He ended up ticketed for public drunkenness and filing a false report. I hesitated. Then the sheriff took Jeff and Mabel to the theater, and the judge was already there. How did he know? Janet avoided my question. Keep going. I sighed. The judge made Mabel sign papers. She protested, but he told her the town protects its own. After that, there was a gathering. Sheriff, judge, mayor, and others. We drank, and I vaguely remember barbecue. Then, I woke up here. Janet nodded. Let me fill in some blanks. She led me to the couch, curling up beside me. Ever since I knew what boys were, I've had a crush on you. Over the years, Mabel and I fought about you, including just last week. Her tone darkened. 6 weeks ago, I dated Jeff. We went out a few times, but he creeped me out. When I looked him up, it got worse. The car he drives, his wife's, his job. He's a paralegal at his father-in-law's firm, not a lawyer. Even his name, Rosberg, is hers. She paused, shaking her head. After we broke up, he spread lies about us. Then people started asking if I'd slept with you. That's when I realized he was also claiming he slept with Mabel. At first, I thought it was nonsense, but then I caught them together. His hand was under her skirt. When I confronted her, she said, "You don't understand. David's always working. I need fun." She called Jeff fun, and he got angry. She backtracked, but said you were too generous with your business and could have made more money. Janet's voice cracked. She said you could have been so much richer. Like money was everything. That's why I'm here with you now. Janet stood abruptly and picked up the phone. "Wait," she said, motioning for me to pause. She dialed and spoke softly, mentioning my name a few times, then handed me the receiver. "Hello?" I answered, my voice uncertain. "Hi, Dave," the caller began. "I'm sorry for your loss, but this might be a blessing in disguise. I need you to confirm the temporary block on your personal accounts." What changes?" I asked, bewildered. The voice on the other end clarified. "Are you authorizing the block on your personal accounts while keeping your business accounts active?" Yeah, I said hesitantly, "as long as my business accounts stay functional." "Absolutely," the voice reassured before I handed the phone back to Janet. She spoke for a few minutes more, occasionally laughing before turning to me. "Lie down, Dave," she said gently. I complied, and she removed my shoes before lying next to me on the couch. She snuggled close, her voice soft. "Mabel begged me not to tell you I caught her with Jeff, but Jeff told her you'd find out when she filed for divorce. She thought he was rich, but as I told you, he's not. He saw her as an opportunity to force you into supporting both of them." "But I loved her," I said quietly. "I know, honey, but you need to forget her. When I told the judge everything, we drafted the divorce papers. We needed leverage to make her sign, so we offered what we thought was fair, a lump sum or monthly payments. The incident at the drive-in was unplanned, but gave us even more evidence." She paused, her tone serious. "Jeff went to jail last night. His wife bailed him out, and he's heading for divorce and financial ruin. Mabel, left to walk home after Jeff's car was impounded, got what she deserved." "It's 30 miles, I muttered. "Good," Janet said, smirking. "As for you, seeing her on that giant screen broke you. The judge decided you needed to drink and forget. I made sure I took care of you afterward." I looked at her. "I don't drink much. Tequila is the worst for me." She chuckled. "Well, you finished the bottle and ate the worm." I felt overwhelmed. "Janet, I'm sorry you had to deal with me. I feel like a broken man, like my rusty old Mustang." Janet sat up, glaring. "David, stop this pity party. You're loved and valued here. The judge, sheriff, and everyone in town care about you. Your business supports both cities, and you're always generous. We won't let anyone, especially my sister, tear you down." Her voice softened as she added, "And about last night, I wanted it. I've always wanted you, Dave. When the chance came, I took it." She studied me for a moment. "You and your Mustang just need a little polish to shine again. You got 60 days before the divorce is finalized. Use it to diet, work out, and restore your car. Maybe Mabel will regret everything, or maybe you'll realize you're ready to move on." Her words lingered, heavy with meaning, as she gazed at me.
I didn't know how far I was from town when an old truck approached. The driver leaned out and asked, "Where are you going?" "I just need to get to town," I said. "How old are you?" he asked. Thinking he might mistake me for younger, I lied. "I'm 35. "Your dress is older than you," he said flatly. "Remember that old hitchhiker saying from the 80s? "No," I replied. "Gasoline, grass, or—" he began. "I don't have money for gas, don't smoke, and—" I started, but he began driving away. "Wait!" I yelled. Desperate, I climbed into the truck bed. What followed was degrading. He used me without care or consent, and I stayed silent, afraid he'd leave me stranded. My mind raced, planning my next steps. I needed money from the bank and to contact both Dave and Jeff. I couldn't wait 60 days for answers. When the truck finally stopped just 10 minutes from town, I was furious. He had taken an hour and a half of my dignity for a short ride. When he leaned in for a kiss, I snapped, "Just drive." Once in town, I sat on a bench outside the bank and fell asleep, too exhausted to care. Even the hard wood felt better than my bed at home. At dawn, a rooster woke me, but the bank was still hours from opening. By 9 a.m., I was starving and walked into a nearby diner. "Can I get breakfast and pay later when the bank opens?" I asked the waitress. She sneered. "No money, no food." Ignoring her, I approached the man behind the counter. "Do you know who I am?" I demanded. "You're a woman who slept in her dress," he said. Furious, I shouted, "Do you know my name?" The man leaned closer, speaking low. "Mabel, I know your name. I also know things about you I wish I didn't, like how you like to be touched. What do you want?" Humiliated and realizing he wasn't going to help, I turned and walked out, trying to preserve what little dignity I had left. As I walked past the back of the restaurant, I saw a man knock on the door. A cook handed him a bag of food. I approached and asked, "Can I have some of that food?" "Show me your bosoms," he muttered. Glancing around to ensure no one could see, I reluctantly pulled down the front of my dress. He grabbed my bosom roughly, then turned me around and grabbed my bum. "Where's my food?" I asked, frustrated. "I'm starving." "What food?" he replied, clutching his bag. "I never said I'd share. You misunderstood. All you have to do is knock on the door. They give leftovers away for free. But sure, keep letting people see your bosoms and grope you." Embarrassed, I left and knocked on the door. The young cook peeked out, saw me, and slammed the door shut. Defeated, I returned to the bank bench, exhausted. I fell asleep again. I woke briefly, thinking rain had fallen, but realized it was only a few drops. By morning, the bank was about to open. Children passing by pointed and laughed at me, their mother smiling smugly. My wrinkled dress didn't seem worth this ridicule. Inside, Sally Anderson, a bank employee, noticed me and smiled knowingly before looking away. In line, others avoided me or laughed quietly. Mary, a childhood acquaintance who handled our finances, took me to her office. "Mary, I'm glad to see you," I said. "I need money. I don't have my wallet." "No problem," she said, smiling. Finally, I thought, someone who respects me. But as she dialed a number, trying not to laugh, I asked, "What's so funny about my dress?" "It's not the dress," she said, handing me a mirror. My reflection was horrifying. Smudged eyeliner, smeared lip gloss, and, to top it off, 2 large bird droppings in my hair. What I mistook for rain was pigeon droppings. "I think $200 will be enough," I said, trying to maintain my dignity. Mary sighed. "Mabel, I meant it doesn't matter if you have your wallet because I can't give you money." "What do you mean?" I snapped. "I have plenty in this bank." "Actually, you don't. Every account you accessed belongs to your husband, or soon-to-be ex-husband. The accounts have been frozen." I stood, furious. "Dave and I are still married. This will all be sorted out. In 60 days, those divorce papers won't mean anything, and you'll all eat crow." Mary laughed. "Drop the R, and we'd be eating you." Still smirking, she handed me an empty bank envelope. "Here's your $0, she said, adding a phone number before I stormed out.
"Dave, I'm so sorry," I heard Mabel say over the phone. "No, Mabel, you made your choice. Now live with it. Dave can't take your call right now," Janet responded firmly. "Janet, you're not taking my husband," Mabel shouted. "Why not? He'll make someone happy, so why not me?" Janet replied calmly. "Because I'm your sister. That has to mean something," Mabel protested. "It does," Janet said coolly. "That's why I called Mom and Dad in Chicago. I didn't tell them about your betrayal. I'll let you explain it to them. Meanwhile, you're going to Chicago for 2 months to give Dave space. Your bus ticket and a suitcase are at the station, along with $20 for food. Maybe when you return, he'll be ready to talk. Or perhaps you'll call Jeff instead." "Thank you, Janet," Mabel said bitterly. "At least you're giving me a chance." "Don't thank me," Janet said coldly. "I'll do everything I can to make sure he's mine." That evening, Janet made me a simple salad for dinner, calling it part of my new diet. Afterward, she insisted I help dry dishes as she refused to own a dishwasher. Later, we sat on the porch under a shared blanket, talking under the stars. She made me open up about my feelings, which felt oddly comforting. In turn, she revealed things about herself I'd never known, despite watching her grow up. Janet managed my computer repair department, yet lived simply. preferring an iPad to a computer and disliking unnecessary luxuries. She was content with her country life, while Mabel had always craved the latest conveniences, seeing rural living as boring. Maybe time in Chicago would suit Mabel better. When it was time for bed, I grabbed the porch blanket and headed to the couch. "What are you doing?" Janet asked. "Going to bed," I replied. "Our bedroom is upstairs," she said pointedly. "You've already slept with me once, and while I don't expect anything, I won't suffer sleeping alone when you're here. Let's just share the bed as friends." Reluctantly, I agreed and followed her upstairs. As I lay beside her, I couldn't help comparing her to Mabel. The warmth of her presence was surprisingly comforting. The next morning, Janet woke me early. "Time for a run before breakfast," she said cheerfully. She handed me workout clothes and mockingly reminded me to wear sneakers. We ran 2 miles to the diner, where I barely made it in time to earn breakfast: juice, bacon, toast, and grapefruit. Janet's plan was to gradually improve my fitness, cutting down my mile time weekly. Watching her lead the way in shorts was surprisingly motivating. After breakfast, we walked back home, where she insisted on squats and push-ups. Her exercise methods included kisses for every rep, which kept me going. Despite my exhaustion, she was proud of my effort. Later, I headed to the workshop, planning to start a renovation. Before I could turn on the lights, the door slammed shut and someone shoved me hard against the wall.
When I arrived in Chicago, I was furious. Janet had packed a suitcase full of mismatched clothes. In the station restroom, I tried changing out of my mint dress but found nothing suitable. She packed tight yellow pants, an orange and purple striped shirt, and mismatched socks and shoes. The only footwear that matched were unstable stiletto heels. I looked ridiculous. A walking circus act with bird poop still in my hair and smudged makeup. Boarding the bus was no better. An old man moved to sit next to me and loudly asked, "How much does Zex cost?" Later, I woke up to find him groping me. I punched him so hard he fell out of his seat, muttering about how I was unfriendly, too expensive, and not worth it. The entire bus heard him. At the first station stop, the driver forced everyone off for a break. Exhausted, I sat on a bench and quickly fell asleep, only to wake up covered in fresh paint and dog urine. My clothes stuck to the bench, and the driver had to tear me free, ruining my shirt. Back on the bus, he lined my seat with newspapers to protect it from the paint on my clothes. By the time we reached Chicago, the newspapers were stuck to me. At the station, my parents were waiting. My dad immediately recoiled. "Mabel, you smell like cat piss." "Actually, it's dog urine," I replied. People laughed at my ridiculous appearance as the old man from the bus approached my dad. "Buddy, she's not worth it. Too expensive, mean, and smells like cat piss. Find someone better," he said before walking off. My dad looked horrified. In the car, he demanded to know what was going on, but my mom cut to the chase. "Mabel, what did you do?" she asked. "Why do you assume I did something?" I snapped. Mom calmly explained, "If someone had hurt you, you'd have told Dave and he'd have dealt with it. If Dave had done something, you'd have called Janet or us. Janet already told us Dave is hurting, but we'll be fine. So what did you do?" I hesitated before admitting, "I'm not sure I want to fix this. Dave is boring. I found someone else." My dad slammed on the brakes, staring at me like I was the dumbest person alive. "What?" he shouted, his disbelief palpable. Over the next few days, I adjusted to life at my parents' house, though they weren't shy about expressing their displeasure. Their 3-room colonial had no spare bedroom. One was a gym, the other a home theater. So I slept on the living room floor in a sleeping bag to avoid ruining their expensive couch. On the 3rd day, I called Jeff. He answered cautiously, but before we could talk, a sharp voice interrupted. "This is Jeff's wife," she snapped. "Did you know he's jobless, homeless, and carless? If you want him, you can come pick up his things." She hung up before I could respond. Shocked, I realized how deluded I'd been. My fantasy world was crumbling. 3 choices lay ahead: build an independent life, find another man to take care of me, or go back to Dave and beg for forgiveness. The last option seemed easiest, but I decided to explore the others first. That night, I looked at job ads but quickly hit a wall. I couldn't even recall what I studied in college. Desperate, I called Dave. After 2 missed attempts, Janet answered his phone. "Your degree is in childhood development," she said mockingly, "but it's irrelevant now." You'd be a terrible mother and an even worse teacher." She hung up before I could reply. Childhood development? I finally remembered that I once dreamed of working with children and having kids with Dave. But as our business thrived, I prioritized fashion and appearances. The thought of pregnancy ruining my figure or wardrobe had driven me to start taking the pill. I couldn't find a job, so I decided to start my own business. But as I brainstormed, my parents' closeness in the next room distracted me. They seemed happy together, something Dave and I had lost long ago. I reflected on how my vanity had distanced us. The $300 hairstyles, the strict beauty routines, the inability to simply hold him at night. Dave always thought I was beautiful, no matter what. Jeff, in contrast, criticized me whenever I wasn't perfect. Frustrated, I refocused. My passion for fashion stood out. Maybe I could open a clothing store and eventually design my own line. Determined, I began making a list of what I'd need to get started. At breakfast the next morning, I asked my father bluntly, "How much money do we have?" He replied sarcastically, "What does we mean, Kemosabe?" "I'm thinking about starting a business and need money," I said. He laughed so hard he nearly fell over. When my mom came in and asked what was so funny, he told her I wanted to start a business using their savings. She didn't laugh but touched my forehead like I might be sick. "Seriously, how much money do you have?" I demanded. He sobered up. "No," he said flatly. Stunned, I asked why. He explained that they'd saved money for retirement and emergencies, but my mom's medical treatments had drained much of it. Dave had covered the remaining costs, telling them to save their money for their dreams, like visiting the Grand Canyon. "So you still have some money?" I pressed. "Yes," he admitted, "but we're taking Dave's advice and using it for ourselves." Angry, I said, "If Dave hadn't paid for Mom's treatment, you wouldn't even be going to the canyon. That money is technically mine, and I want it." Dad snapped, "Mabel, you've been spoiled. You don't lift a finger, and now you think you're entitled to everything. I'll call Dave. If he says to give you the money, we'll do it." He called Dave, spoke briefly, then returned grinning. "Dave said the money for your mom's treatment wasn't about your marriage. It was family helping family. He said he'll keep helping us no matter what happens with you. He also offered to pay for a helicopter tour of the canyon. As for you, he suggested you go to the bank for a loan just like he did." I cried. For such a boring guy, Dave had solid advice. "Mabel, 2 more things," Dad added. "What happened with you and Dave? He seems too upset for this to be minor." "I thought I found someone better," I admitted. "I was wrong." "And," he continued, "you need to start paying rent." "What?" I shouted. "Charging your own daughter to sleep on the floor?" I stopped myself, nodded, and said we'd discuss it later. That afternoon, I borrowed a decent dress from my mom and went to the bank. The loan manager asked questions I wasn't prepared for. Did I have collateral, business management experience, a business plan, rent, or buy what? I had no idea. Flustered, I apologized and left. Defeated, I went home, realizing I was in way over my head.
I was slammed against the wall in my workshop, thinking someone was trying to steal tools. The hands on me weren't violent, but were checking for weapons. My heart raced in fear until I reached for the light and saw Janet's smiling face. "You scared me," I shouted. "Well, you're not holding up your end of our deal," she shot back. Janet wore mechanic-style overalls, unzipped halfway to reveal her bare chest beneath. Her hair was tied back and she looked both casual and confident. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Last night you shared a bed with an undressed, willing woman and you did nothing," she accused. "You said I didn't have to do anything," I reminded her. "I lied," she admitted. "Did you enjoy it?" I nodded, explaining how comforting it was to feel close to someone again. "It felt like being loved." "The word is love," Janet snapped. "But it's not free. If you keep sharing my bed, you'll owe me." She grinned and teasingly rubbed the front of my pants. "Don't worry, it seems like you're ready to pay." She led me to the computer where we worked on customizing my car. We debated everything: wheels, brakes, color, and even engine mods. After hours of planning and disassembling the car, we decided to pause. Back at her house, she suggested I change clothes. Though we were sharing her room, she had put my clothes in the guest room. Apparently, even Janet wouldn't share her closet. We showered together to clean off the car grease, then dressed quickly. Janet emerged in jeans and a fitted shirt, looking stunning. For the first time, I saw her not as Mabel's younger sister, but as a beautiful, confident woman. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To the movies," she said. "People need to see you're not broken by what happened with my sister." At the theater, we watched a Nicolas Cage movie, Janet's favorite. Afterward, we strolled down the street, holding hands and chatting about the film. Conversation with Janet was effortless, a stark contrast to my interactions with Mabel. With Mabel, our talks had dwindled to business or fashion, neither of which interested the other. With Janet, I never ran out of things to say. It felt natural, easy, and refreshing. We laughed all through dinner at a diner and later sat on Janet's porch talking. She was open about so many things but refused to take some topics seriously. When I thanked her for helping me cope with Mabel's betrayal, she rolled her eyes. "Men," she said dismissively. During dinner, a few townsfolk expressed sympathy for what happened with Mabel, but when someone suggested Janet and I were close, she became defensive. "I'm just helping him as family," she said, then jokingly added, "And no, Sally, don't rush to take off your big undies." The next morning, after our run, Millie Tyler waited on Janet's porch. "Good morning, Janet," she said sharply, then turned to me with a syrupy tone. "Good morning, Dave." Janet immediately went on the defensive. "Millie, it's too early for visits, and Dave has exercises to do." Ignoring her, Millie smiled at me. "I'm sorry for what Mabel did to you, Dave. I'd love to invite you over for dinner to help you through this tough time." Her low-cut dress left little to the imagination, and Janet wasn't having it. "Millie, get off my porch," Janet snapped. "If Dave wants to see you, he'll do it somewhere else. Don't come back here." Millie handed me a strawberry pie, but Janet grabbed it and hurled it down the driveway. "He's on a diet and allergic to strawberries," she barked, dragging me inside. That morning's workout was no nonsense, no kisses or playful encouragement. When I struggled, she snapped, "Do you just want more time to stare at Millie's giant bosoms?" "Of course not," I said. "Those things would suffocate me." Janet smiled when I admitted I preferred something in the middle, neither Millie's nor Mabel's size. Over the following weeks, Janet and I were inseparable. We exercised, worked on my car, and shared meals together. I lost nearly 20 pounds and felt like a new man. In the 5th week, she suggested a haircut and helped pick out new suits for me, celebrating my transformation. She even planned a dinner out in another town to mark the new me. As we neared finishing the car, we debated final touches like a hood intake system. The car project, like everything else we worked on together, felt effortless and fun. One night, things shifted. As we lay in bed, Janet turned to me, and what began as routine closeness became deeply passionate. She whispered intimate words, asking me to make her mine, and I realized I wanted her too. When she softly said, "Love you, Dave," it broke something open in me. But afterward, she abruptly left the bed, seeming regretful. The next morning, Janet was distant, claiming she felt unwell. She reassured me she wouldn't miss our planned dinner, but seemed off all day. That night, Janet looked stunning, and the dinner felt perfect. But after the meal, she leaned forward with a serious tone. "Dave, you're ready to stand on your own again. It's time to move forward." Confused, I asked, "Is this about last night?" She dismissed it. "You're in better shape now, but you're still the same wonderful man my sister married. Go to court, see her, and decide what you want. If you take her back, make sure she changes. There's nothing wrong with you." We shared a bed that night, but only for sleep. The next morning, Janet left for Chicago to visit her parents, leaving me to face the future on my own.
I can't stand my parents right now. This past week, they've been busy converting the media room into a new bedroom. Apparently, they're preparing for some important guest who needs his own space. Meanwhile, I've been relegated to sleeping on the living room floor like some kind of stray dog. I don't even bother trying to sneak onto the couch at night anymore because if my dad catches me there during one of his late-night bathroom trips, he loses his temper. I decided to abandon the idea of starting my own business and chose the alternative, finding a new man. In the past 7 weeks, I've only managed to go on 3 dates, and they've mostly been disasters, except for one that showed a glimmer of hope. The first 2, though, were just awful. The first guy was a stockbroker. He was loaded and took me to an upscale French restaurant that seemed impossible to get into. We were seated in a dimly lit booth at the very back of the place, even though I had asked for a table closer to the entrance or in the center. When the head waiter asked where we'd like to sit, my date insisted on the shadowy corner. "It's more intimate back here," he said. The food was incredible, but after dinner he invited me to his home. Once there, he grabbed a bottle of wine, settled in, and nonchalantly told me, "Take off your clothes." "What?" I said, completely caught off guard. "Take off your clothes," he repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Excuse me, but I don't do anything like that until at least the third or fourth date," I replied, still in shock. He had seemed so cultured. "Well, listen, what's your name?" he asked. "Mabel," I corrected him. "Yeah, whatever. The truth is, the woman I actually want to be with is busy tonight. You were my backup plan. I'm not looking for a girlfriend without benefits. So if you're planning to wait for a third or fourth date, forget it. There won't even be a second date. Now, take off your clothes." I stood up immediately and said, "Take me home right now." "You've got legs," he sneered. "Use them." "Can you at least call me a taxi?" I asked. "Oh, sure," he smirked. "You're a taxi." He then slammed the door in my face. I had no idea where I was, but thankfully I knew my parents' address. I started walking toward what looked like a main road, hoping to find a store or restaurant where I could call for a ride. Before I got there, it started raining lightly, then turned into a full-blown downpour. By the time I reached the road, I looked like a soaked stray cat as I stepped into a shop to call a cab. The second date was even more memorable, but not in a good way. I'd met the guy on a dating website. He checked all my boxes. Wealthy, cultured, generous. A sophisticated man I'd hoped Dave would grow into. At 7:30 p.m., a limousine pulled up in front of my parents' house. I climbed in, only to be greeted by the oldest man I'd ever seen. He was so frail that he had an oxygen tank built into the car. He wheezed between breaths. "You're older than I expected, and carrying a bit more weight." Before we'd even left the block, he tried to grope me with his bony hands. Softer than I like," he muttered in disappointment. Suddenly his eyes rolled back, alarms went off, and the driver stopped the car. He jumped into the back, injected the old man with something, and started performing CPR. While doing this, he looked at me and said, "You should probably get out." We were 5 miles from my parents' house. As I started walking, I saw a store where I could call for help. But before I got there, 2 men emerged from an alley and dragged me into it. One rifled through my bag and sneered, "$3 lousy? Where's the rest?" "That's all I have," I shrugged. "I'm going through a divorce." "Well, strip," the other one said. "We don't have all day." I refused, yelling, "There's no way I'm getting undressed for you." That earned me a slap so hard my head spun. One of them gently removed my skirt and top, leaving me standing there in my underwear. To my surprise, they didn't attack me further. "Her chest is a bit soft," one muttered as they walked off with my clothes. "We'll sell these and get enough for a real girl." I stood there, humiliated and half undressed, wondering how things could possibly get worse. That's when I felt a familiar wetness on my head and looked up. A bird had just crapped on me. My third date managed to outdo the others. The guy picked me up in his car and immediately started groping me. When I asked where we were going, he parked in an empty lot. "This isn't a date," he said with a smirk. "What do you mean?" I asked, dumbfounded. "Listen, you've been on a string of bad dates, haven't you?" he said smugly. I thought about it and realized he was right. My dating life had been one big disaster, and I was starting to feel like an idiot for thinking otherwise. Dave used to make me feel like I was the most special person in the world. Over time, as I grew older and my body changed, so did Dave's preferences. He began to admire women with fuller figures, which only made him adore me more. Unlike every other guy I'd dated, who treated me like nothing more than an object, Dave genuinely loved me. Even Jeff, the deceitful idiot who started all this, never came close to what Dave offered me. My current date interrupted my thoughts. "You know," he began, "when a woman has a bad date, she loses some time. But when a guy has a bad date, he loses both time and money, and it usually takes several dates just to find out if there's even a chance of sex. After that, it might take a few more times to figure out if she's actually any good in bed." "You've got a point," I admitted reluctantly. "I guess men do have it harder in that regard." That's why I decided to cut out the guesswork, he said smugly. I don't go on dates anymore. I hold auditions. This isn't a date. This is your audition. Don't get me wrong. I like you, but I don't bend the rules for anyone. An audition? I asked, incredulous. What exactly am I supposed to do in this so-called audition? Talk about myself? Share my preferences? He chuckled dismissively. No, sweetheart. Save all that romantic nonsense for the actual date, if you make it that far. Right now, you can start by stripping and lying down in the back seat. You expect me to sleep with you just to earn a date? I shouted in disbelief. He nodded, completely unbothered by my outrage. And what if I say no? I shot back, my tone mocking. He shrugged casually. Your choice, but it's a long walk home and I'd suggest you get started. Frustrated, I opened the car door and stepped out, only to notice dark clouds overhead and an ominous flock of pigeons circling above. It was clear that the weather, and those birds, were about to make my night even worse. Fine, I muttered, resigning myself to what felt like the lesser of two evils. Not long after, we were in the back seat of his car, doing exactly what he'd proposed. As I stared blankly at the car's upholstery, I couldn't help but think about how far I'd fallen, and how much I missed Dave. Dating was clearly a dead end, and I began to realize just how unique Dave had been. Every man I'd been with since him was selfish, focused only on their own satisfaction. Dave, on the other hand, had loved me wholeheartedly, and I'd ruined it. We had sex twice before he finally drove me home. As I stepped out of the car, I tried to leave as quickly as possible, but he rolled down the window and called after me. Thanks for the chat, but I don't think we should date. You're like a lifeless plank in bed. I was ready to burst out laughing at the absurdity of his comment, until I noticed my parents and my sister Janet standing on the porch, staring at me in stunned silence. Wow, you're easy, Janet scoffed before storming back inside. My parents followed her without a word, leaving me alone in the driveway. What's wrong with you, Mabel? My dad finally demanded. Why does Janet get her own room while I'm stuck sleeping on the floor? I shot back. Because Janet isn't married, he replied sharply. She doesn't have a husband to return to, and she's dealing with a tough time emotionally. Well, if things don't change soon, I won't have a husband to return to either, I cried, my voice breaking. Janet reappeared then, her expression filled with judgment. Mabel cheated on Dave, she announced. She got caught, and the whole town knows about it. We're all just trying to clean up the mess. How did she get caught? My dad asked, bewildered. You know those cameras in the drive-in theater parking lot that show people on the big screen? Janet explained. My dad started laughing. Those are hilarious. They always catch people eating or doing something embarrassing. Well, Janet continued coldly, they caught your daughter in a car with some guy groping her bosoms while she... Well, you can imagine the rest. The whole town saw it. Afterward, Dave and the community pushed her to sign an agreement the judge issued. What kind of agreement? My mom asked. It's called an overnight divorce. In this state, divorces take at least 60 days. In 10 more days, Mabel and Dave will finalize their papers. They'll have a meeting to confirm the terms of the divorce, but Mabel already signed them under pressure. If she hadn't, people probably would have tarred and feathered her. Once the paperwork is done, both of them can do whatever they want with whoever they want. I'm not signing anything, I shouted. Over the last couple of months, I've realized how much I need Dave back. I know I can win him over. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to spend the entire week fighting for him. Anything to end this nightmare. Janet's face softened, but her words remained firm. I don't want Dave making choices because he feels trapped, she said quietly. He's one of the kindest people I know. He deserves to make decisions for himself, ones that will make him truly happy. With that, she turned and disappeared into her room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a renewed determination to fix the mess I'd made of my life. 2 days later, I stepped off the bus and hailed a taxi to take me back home. To my surprise, the locks on the doors hadn't been changed. Even my keys were still sitting on the hallway table where I'd left them. That felt like a positive sign. Maybe Dave hadn't locked me out because deep down, he still wanted me there. I headed upstairs and enjoyed my first real shower in what felt like forever. Afterward, I rummaged through my closet, searching for something nice to wear. I picked out a gorgeous dress and a barely there sheer lingerie set. The underwear, however, must have shrunk in the wash. I struggled to pull them over my hips. When I finally managed to squeeze into them, they were so tight they left deep indentations on my thighs, and the waistband snapped. At least the bra still fit, though I couldn't get the dress on either. Frustrated, I settled on a different outfit. It was also snug, but at least it didn't tear. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was already 9 a.m., and I needed to be in court by 10. There was no time to waste. Sliding into the plush driver's seat of my car, I couldn't help but sigh with relief. God, I'd miss this car. As I drove into the city and approached the main square, a sleek white Mustang sped past me. It was a beauty. Maybe I could convince my stubborn, old-fashioned husband to ditch his clunky, rusted Mustang for something like that. A few moments later, I noticed the white Mustang had parked just a few spaces down from me. It was nice to see new people settling in the area, I thought. But as the driver stepped out of the car, I froze in shock. It was Dave, my husband, Dave. He looked incredible. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, and his freshly cut hair gave him an entirely new look. I barely recognized him. He was more attractive than I'd ever seen him before. While I sat there staring, he disappeared into a nearby building. My heart raced at the thought of seeing him later that evening. Maybe I'd even surprise him at work. I hadn't stopped by his office in years, and it felt like the right time to change that. Suddenly, winning him back wasn't just a desperate attempt to fix my life. It was something I genuinely wanted to do.
I sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, watching a man's reputation crumble right before my eyes. I couldn't help but think, that could have been me. If it weren't for the judge, the sheriff, Janet, and a handful of others, I'd be standing there in the same miserable state as that poor guy. His wife seemed to revel in his downfall, her dominance on full display. Was Mabel any better during our marriage? Maybe. Sure, I controlled the finances, but Mabel had me wrapped around her finger in every other way. Honestly, was there much of a difference? Watching Jeffrey's humiliation had a twisted satisfaction, but even for me, it felt excessive. Mabel took the stand and shared her version of events. It gave me a glimpse into what had gone wrong between her and Jeffrey, or at least what she was willing to admit in a courtroom setting. By the end of it, Jeff was left with little more than the clothes on his back and my reluctant sympathy. As his wife, flanked by her team of sharp-suited attorneys, strode out of the room, she caught my eye and smirked. "Your turn," she said. "Teach that witch a lesson." I turned to leave, but before I made it to the door, Mabel rushed up behind me. "Dave, sweetheart, I'm so sorry for everything," she said, her voice trembling. "I wasn't myself. I think my hormones were out of balance. Something was wrong with me. I didn't mean to hurt you." I glanced at her. "You look different," I said, then turned and walked away. "Wait, Dave, are you heading home? Can we talk? Maybe have dinner together?" she called after me. "I don't think so, Mabel," I replied, smiling as I headed for the exit. "See you in court." I whistled as I walked out, finally clear on what I wanted and the steps I needed to take. 8 days later, Janet returned to town. The first person she ran into was Millie at the grocery store parking lot. "Hey, Millie," Janet said, trying to sound casual. "Sorry about, what happened a few weeks ago." Millie waved it off. "No big deal. We were both chasing after the same guy. It happens." "Have you heard anything about your sister?" Millie asked. Janet shook her head. "No, what's going on?" She and her husband decided to sell their big house and move away. They've been driving around town in that flashy car of theirs, barking orders and spending money like it's going out of style. Can't wait to skip town, I guess. Janet murmured. "It's funny how people can turn things around like that. After all he's been through, the divorce and everything, you'd think he'd show a little more backbone." Millie shrugged. "Once a pushover, always a pushover." Janet felt her stomach drop. She had hoped Dave would show more strength, but she realized she couldn't rely on anyone else to change her circumstances. She'd just have to keep moving forward. When Janet pulled into her driveway, she noticed a white Mustang parked there. For a moment, she wondered if Dave had left it as a parting gift, a thoughtful gesture to signify their time together. Her heart swelled at the thought, even though she'd convinced herself it was time to let him go. She had slipped up by expressing her true feelings, and the next morning she knew it was best for both of them to move on. As she struggled with the door lock, it suddenly opened, and she was pulled into a tight embrace. "Welcome home," Dave said, his arms wrapping around her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to sound annoyed. "Shouldn't you be with my sister?" "Why would I be with her?" he replied calmly. "Janet, I love you. Mabel and I are divorced. I gave her the house, some cash, and told her to sell it within 6 months. If she doesn't, I'll have it torn down to build a community sports center for kids." Janet raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly do you plan to live?" "With you, if you'll let me," he said with a small smile. "If not, I'll settle for the guest room." "Oh, you're not staying in the guest room," she replied, pulling him to the porch swing. She wrapped her arms around him as they sat down. "Dave, the guest room won't exist much longer," she teased. He grinned. "Finally converting it into a media room? About time you joined the 21st century." "Not quite," she said, smiling mischievously. "It's going to be a nursery, for now, at least." Dave froze, his expression a mix of surprise and realization. "You mean—" "Yeah," Janet said, placing her hand on her stomach. "You got me pregnant. And Dave, I love you too." "Well, it's a good thing I didn't give all the money to Mabel," he said, grinning. "Why's that?" she asked, laughing. "Because when you're pregnant again, we'll need to add another room," he teased. Janet leaned into him, her hands resting over her tiny baby bump. "By the way, who's Mabel's new man?" she asked. Dave chuckled. "Jeffrey. When the divorce was finalized, I gave them a deal, $1 million and a house to split, but only if they stayed together. The catch is, if one cheats or leaves, they lose everything." Janet laughed. "And they agreed to that? They didn't have much choice. Now they hate each other, but hate being broke even more. Jeffrey can't stand looking at Mabel, especially after she gained 50 pounds, and Mabel blames him for ruining her life." "They'll destroy each other," Janet said, stretching her legs across his lap. "Probably," Dave replied. "But enough about them. We have unfinished business." "Like what?" Janet asked. "Well, when this started, I was happily married. Now, I'm happy again, but not married." Janet's eyes softened. "Are you saying—" "I need Millie's number," Dave joked. She tackled him to the veranda floor, laughing. As he groaned, she asked, "What did I break? Your leg?" "No, the box with your ring," he said, smirking. Janet rummaged through his pocket and found the ring, setting it aside before focusing on him instead. "The ring is important," she said with a mischievous grin, "but I've wanted this for a long time." Afterward, she grabbed the ring and ran to her car. "Janet, where are you going?" Dave asked, still lying on the veranda. "I'm going to show Millie and the rest of the town my ring so they'll back off," she shouted with a grin before speeding off. They married a few months later, had 4 children, and built a beautiful life together. Less than a year after their wedding, Mabel returned to town, broke and desperate. She and Jeffrey had burned through all the money and split up. Jeffrey ended up in jail for writing bad checks, and rumors swirled about his close relationship with his cellmate. Mabel, with nowhere to go, asked for help. Despite everything, Janet and Dave took her in, giving her a job as a delivery driver for minimum wage and letting her live in a small apartment above the garage. Occasionally, they paid her extra to babysit their children. "Her child development degree is finally being put to use," Janet joked. Sometimes Mabel would glance at their happy family with longing. Janet and Dave would just smile and wave, knowing she had to live with her choices. "Some people think Mabel got off too easy," Dave admitted once. "But the best revenge is a life well lived. I'm happier now with Janet than I ever was with Mabel." Janet agreed. "I got the life she threw away. She has to see it every day and know what she lost." Over time, Janet and Dave's love grew stronger, their family flourished, and the mistakes of the past became lessons and stories to share. It wasn't just a happy ending. It was a life well earned and fully lived.